Welcome back to the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, coming to you from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. Few contemporary analysts of foreign policy are as influential among elite opinion and policymakers as our next guest. Not only is he the author of what many regard as the definitive study of the inner workings of the National Security Council, his reach is so vast, his ownership of the subject so thorough and complete in our digital age, that he is the universally acknowledged overlord of the website foreignpolicy.com. We are pleased to welcome to the Foxhole David Rothkopf, CEO and editor of the FP Group, and as such, publisher of Foreign Policy Magazine and foreignpolicy.com. He is also president and CEO of the international advisory firm Garton Rothkopf, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the author, most recently, of National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear, published in October by Public Affairs. David, welcome to the Foxhole.
My pleasure to be here.
What motivated you to write this book?
Well, it's actually a follow-up to Running the World, which was a history of the NSC from its inception through to about 2005. Book did kind of well, and publisher kept coming back saying, let's update it. And by the time we got sort of halfway through the Obama administration, we had the second term of Bush and the first term of Obama. It seemed like there was something to work with there. And I was interested in more broadly in the post-9/11 period and how that was different from how foreign policy was made before, how it led to dysfunction, and what we might learn from it.
Who are the key actors in this drama, if you will?
Well, the two key actors are George Bush and Barack Obama, because the way our national security system is set up, everything flows from the president. The NSC, although it was created by an act in 1947 to include the key members of the cabinet, and there's a support staff involved, it's actually evolved in a variety of ways, and it changes with every president. So how the system works, how decisions are made, how the system is managed, depends entirely on the boss. And in this case, we had two very different bosses, two very different approaches, and yet in both cases, there was a similarity in the outcomes. They weren't very good. And I don't think either one of these guys is going to go down in history as a foreign policy president, and so the question is why? Here we had a big crisis, and in the wake of the crisis, we yawed from one extreme to the other. And what can we learn from that?
What are the differences in the approach toward the use or organization or running of the National Security Council between Presidents Bush and Obama?
Well, I don't want to dodge the question. There's kind of a first Bush and a second Bush. In the beginning, Bush was learning foreign policy. He was fairly new to it. He had a very influential vice president. The vice president was very close to a very influential defense secretary. The president's national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, faced a choice that all national security advisors do. Do I advise the president or do I run the process? She chose really to advise the president. She was close to him, spent 6 to 7 hours a day with him. This kind of left the process open to be hijacked. The vice president and the secretary of defense essentially did that. They commandeered it. They weren't very trustful of the secretary of state, Colin Powell. That pushed him a little bit out of the process. And it's that kind of shifting around that leads a small group to have too much influence, there to be tensions within the process not to provide the kind of foresight that you want to see in the process, for it to be a little reactive. And that was really the case throughout the first Bush term. The interesting thing about Bush, the thing that I don't think is fully appreciated, is that he recognized things weren't going very well. And particularly after his electoral, he was reelected, but things were close, and then even in 2006 there was a bad midterm, the thumping, right? He said something's got to change, and in the course of those first 2 years, he changed his chief of staff. He pushed back on the vice president's role. By late 2006, he had changed Rumsfeld out for Gates. He moved Condoleezza Rice over to the State Department. He promoted Stephen Hadley. He brought in Hank Paulson as Secretary of the Treasury. He had a whole new team, and he was willing to embrace new strategies. He listened to General Jack Keane, brought in David Petraeus, initiated the surge in Iraq, began a whole series of diplomatic initiatives, and actually finished strong.
Just before we proceed to the contrast with Obama, did you observe that in making these changes, there occurred a toll on the Bush-Cheney relationship.
Yeah, I think there was a toll. I think they stayed functional to the end. I think we tend to overstate these things and say, well, we go from one extreme to the other, total Cheney domination to total Cheney irrelevance. Well, that didn't happen. Cheney was never totally dominant, but he was more dominant in the first term than he was in the second term. There were tensions in the relationship, the Scooter Libby probe and so forth, which really did produce some tensions. And I think the president became more confident. He knew more what he wanted to do. He recognized that some of the things that he had been advised to do weren't working. He had good advisors who are now, Condoleezza Rice was not going to be bullied around in the process. She got more confident. Steve Hadley was an excellent national security advisor, served as an honest broker and a good advisor. Things worked better.
And then in the Obama administration, is there a marked difference in the way Mr. Bush's successor in the Oval Office ran the National Security Council?
Sure, on several levels. First of all, Barack Obama had no management experience. So, he came in and he didn't really have a lot of models to choose from. He did the right thing very early on. He brought in a bunch of powerful, strong-willed cabinet members, the so-called team of rivals, Hillary Clinton and Leon Panetta and Bob Gates and so forth. And you had a sense that perhaps you would have this kind of balanced process. But the problem was that right at the core was his campaign team. They never really disbanded. They never got out of campaign mode and into governing mode. They excluded some of these people. And now you've got the Gates book, the Clinton book, the Panetta book.
And the Valley Nasser book, which was the first book, really, to expose that rift.
Exactly. And essentially you have cabinet secretaries who feel underutilized, under-listened to, underappreciated, and frustrated by slow decision processes, White House-centric decision processes, risk aversion in key areas like Syria. I interview 50 or 60 people from the Bush administration, 50 or 60 people from the Obama administration. I try to set aside the partisan analysis. And what you find is that during the Obama years, particularly recently, particularly in the last 2 years, the process has really broken down. There is the rivals are gone, right? That sort of senior team is gone. We now know of their frustrations through their books. John Kerry, who's tenacious and hardworking, is kind of out there solving problems. He's not at the center, as we know from last year when the Syria decision took place, and he wasn't even in the room.
It was with Dennis McDonough out on the colonnade somewhere, right?
Right. The president took a walk. The president said to John Kerry, "Go sell my war," and then he took a walk on the south lawn of the White House with Dennis McDonough and said, "Let's not have that war."
Kerry's face in that sit-room photo is almost iconic, where he's receiving the news from President Obama that they're going to seek a congressional authorization and tamp the whole thing down, and Kerry's face is just etched with concern.
And you see even in the issue that you raised there, first they didn't need congressional authorization. Right. Then they decided to have congressional authorization. This past summer, when they decide that they're going to go in to fight in Iraq again, they say we don't need congressional authorization. Now they're talking they do need congressional authorization. The only thing you know out of that is there's no principle guiding this.
And people are being beheaded.
Well, exactly, and they're reacting to crises. They are not staying ahead of it. The campaigns tend to be tactical. Campaign teams tend to be tactical. They're not strategic. They're not taking the big picture. They are being reactive. They are responding to what they see as bad headlines as opposed to bad developments for U.S. national security or U.S. national interests.
The critics of Barack Obama have seized on the Syria Red Line episode with chemical weapons. But so also, I think, have more dispassionate observers as a real critical juncture in President Obama's tenure, and one that was profoundly destabilizing for our allies and for our relationships around the world. Do you agree?
I think it was a turning point. I think he shouldn't have said it was a red line. The red line was then crossed not once, but a dozen times. When he decided to act, he should have acted. When he didn't act, He called into question not just U.S. policy, but U.S. resolve in the region. This opened the door not just in Syria, but to the Russians and others. But I think it's also important not to overstate that one incident and look at it in the broader context. Let's just take the past 18 months. When there was upheaval in Egypt, we didn't know whose side we were on. There was a gap between the White House.
At several points.
At several points, right? You had the blinking with the Red Line on Syria. You then had the NSA scandal, where it wasn't just that we did what happened with, overseas surveillance, but we actually lied to our allies and alienated our allies by the way that we handled it. You then had Russia and Crimea, where we had to say it's a reluctant response is being charitable. I mean, I think we were caught like a deer in the headlights. We didn't really know what we wanted to do. We started with these kind of pinprick sanctions around a few people. It had no effect. I mean, now the administration says, oh yeah, there's a big effect to the sanctions. Look how bad the Russian economy is. Well, first of all, the Russian economy was lousy, and secondly, the price of oil is going down, and thirdly, I'm not even so sure that at this point the economic pressure on them isn't going to provoke them into a worse act. Furthermore, we've decided to keep the channels open with the Russians because we need them on the Iran deal, which the administration wants very much, and we need them to deal with Assad in Syria at some point. And so, we're not really credibly talking tough to them on one side and then, collaborating with them on the other. We have the same problem with Iran in Iraq.
And to that litany of events you just recited, I think plausibly we could add Benghazi as the kind of further wages of irresolution on the part of the president.
Well, you could, but something. I know Benghazi is very popular to beat up on in some corners. You know what the real problem is? It's not Benghazi.
The lack of response to Benghazi? Or?
No, it's Libya.
Well,
it's the
setting.
We went in, we intervened, and then we got the heck out of Dodge, and the place is on fire right now. I mean, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, and others are actually starting to intervene in Libya because they're worried that the spillover from the chaos we left behind is potentially destabilizing to Egypt.
Around the world, what you're painting is a kind of a picture of what happens when American leadership is in retrenchment or retreat, correct?
Absolutely, and I think the story of the last 11 years, and again, what I try to do is tell it out of the mouths of the people from the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and from world leaders, is of the Bush administration essentially overreacting to 9/11, going into Iraq, doing a lot of damage as a consequence of that. Obama overreacting to Bush, doing too little, leaning back from too many situations. And, we find ourselves at a juncture now when we went from one kind of bad relationship with the world to another kind of bad relationship with the world. And the real question is, how do we find a constructive medium that actually works?
Our visitor to the Foxhole today is David Rothkopf, CEO and editor of the FP Group, and as such, publisher of Foreign Policy Magazine and foreignpolicy.com. He is also president and CEO of the international advisory firm Gartner Rothkopf, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the author, most recently, of National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear, published in October by Public Affairs. So one of our regular features on this program is that we ask the guest of honor to choose a passage from his or her book, and we read it aloud and then discuss in depth. And today our guest, David Rothkopf, chose this passage from page 369 of National Insecurity, published by Public Affairs last month. Quote, "We cannot let the bitter experience of the past few years, our broken politics at home, our fatigue, our lack of clarity about our goals, serve as excuses to keep us from grappling with the hard problems that are being thrown at us by the world daily. It is the equivalent of pulling the sheets over our head when the alarm goes off and hoping the day will pass us by. It never works. Just as we have learned, we should neither allow ourselves to be whipped into an emotional frenzy to achieve impossible goals in the name of revenge or ideology, nor can we let ourselves be lulled into inaction by a litany of false choices where the only alternative to total war is passivity, where the only alternative to international risk is withdrawal. For the next president," writes David Rothkopf, "one of the most important lessons of 9/11, that there is no such thing as a distant problem in the modern world, must counterbalance the impulses that led our two most recent presidents to go either too far or to do too little. The next commander-in-chief cannot afford to let divisions at home keep us from adapting, engaging the world, and advancing our interests as we must. That's David Rothkopf writing in National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear. There has from time to time, since 9/11, been raised this notion that that event, as horrific and traumatic as it was, has been allowed a kind of outsized status in the subsequent crafting or approach to all national security policy making. And it sounds to me like from that passage, as though you may agree with that 9/11 has been accorded an outsized influence relative to what actually happened in how we go about moving our military around, our spending priorities, and so forth. Do you agree?
I absolutely do agree. Look, 9/11 was a catastrophe, a tragedy, an atrocity, and it was something that required a response from the United States, a strong response against the perpetrators. But, you know, we fell into the terrorist trap. The terrorist trap is to actually over-respond and to allow the terror to get the best of you and to behave in a way that promotes their message and undermines your message. We reordered our entire national security apparatus to make terrorism our principal concern. It should have been a concern. But is it more important than the rise of other powers? Is it more important than problems that we've got at home? Is it more important than the threats posed from traditional powers or the decline of our alliances or the emergence of new threats from technology and so forth? It is certainly not. And we let it to claim all the bandwidth and all the budget. And it was extremely damaging to us. So we need to put things back into perspective and not essentially give terrorists the upper hand by giving terrorism too much of our mind share.
David Rothkopf is also the author of Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the architects of American power, also published by Public Affairs back in 2005. I know that you previously worked for Kissinger Associates. A lot of this literature that surrounds the National Security Council posits Henry Kissinger's time as National Security Advisor in the first Nixon term as kind of the apogee of power for the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. Through your scholarship on the NSC as an institution, would you agree that that was the moment where the National Security Advisor enjoyed the greatest power that any National Security Advisor ever has, the first Nixon term?
It's an interesting question. I see Henry Kissinger's NSC as the beginning of the modern NSC. Prior to Henry Kissinger, it was not a kind of center of power. And for Henry, obviously, he had a unique position because he's the only person ever to have simultaneously served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State.
Well, that was the second term.
Right, but I'm saying, you know, that was a sign of the concentration of power in him. Mm-hmm. But he had 30 people working in that NSC, roughly. Mm-hmm. There are 370 people working in the NSC now. He worked in a system where there was distributed roles, traditional roles played by state and defense and so forth. Now a lot of those roles are played within the White House. Between Henry and now, there has been this kind of increase in centralization that has put more and more of the decision-making apparatus in the White House. So he may have, as a person, been the most dominant person, but the modern NSC is much more powerful than his NSC was.
And you make the point in both of these books about how the role of the National Security Advisor in theory is to be an honest broker of the various competing policy proposals being put forward by the members of the National Security Council, the Secretaries of State and Defense and so forth. But isn't it an inevitable temptation on the part of the National Security Advisor, having honestly presented to the Commander-in-Chief the options that are available or being proposed, to then weigh in with his or her own advice, and as the final person with the President's ear, perhaps to try and guide policy that way?
It's a temptation. The best National Security Advisor is the only person ever to have had the job twice, and this is universally acknowledged, and that's General Brent Scowcroft. And Scowcroft, you know, was in a unique position because the President of the United States was one of his closest friends in the world. So he had special access to George H.W. Bush in this second time around. He had a very strong relationship, even though it was periodically a rivalry, with James Baker, who was the Secretary of State. But they had an understanding. And the thing that everybody knew and felt about Brent Scowcroft was when he would go to the President, he would represent the range of views within the administration fairly. He would then if asked or if he felt it was necessary, offer his view, but not to the detriment of the other views, but in addition to those other views. And then, when a decision was made by the president, he would go and faithfully implement that decision and not skew it one way or another towards his view. It's that kind of fairness or honest broker role, as you put it, that's absolutely essential in this job, because this is essentially the orchestrator of all the tools of American foreign policy.
And, forgive the interruption, but if the other participants on the NSC don't perceive the National Security Advisor who's chairing the process as an honest broker, it will sort of offer a green light to each of those participants to try to abuse the process or go seek their policy outcome directly somehow, correct?
Right, yeah, absolutely. Or if the president doesn't enforce that role, then you can end up with this kind of situation, as you had early in the Bush administration, with the process being backdoored, with or Donald Rumsfeld going to NSC meetings and saying, you know, I'm not prepared for this meeting, I'll get back to you. And then going to Cheney or going to the president directly and offering his view outside of the context of the NSC meeting. Or
perhaps even having influenced Bush in the matter at hand before that NSC meeting ever even convened.
Well, and that happened. So, you know, that's a dysfunctional process. That's not one that people trust. That's one that builds animosity with state or whomever is being cut out of the process. And it doesn't serve the president. Because when the process works best, the president is presented with choices. Those choices are supported by intelligence. He evaluates or she evaluates, makes a decision, and then implements. And another example of how it can go wrong is sometimes this president, Barack Obama, apparently goes into meetings and essentially tips his hand about the outcome he wants. And of course, you know, the minute that happens, there's no process, because the way the Washington works, you know, if the president wants this, then there's a scurry around the table to support and justify and move in that direction. And so you've got to have a president who knows how to use the tool. I think a lot of Brent Scowcroft's success was due to the fact that out of the past 6 presidents, George H.W. Bush was the only one with any real foreign policy experience. He had been vice president, he had been at the CIA, he'd been at the UN, he'd been in China, he knew what he was doing, he knew what he wanted, and he knew how to use the process. So you had a president who knew how to use the process, with a national security advisor who'd done the job already, and a very experienced team around them.
And the figure, I would imagine, for whom we could say the same subsequent to that time frame would be Dick Cheney, who really knew how to use the process and had that experience, right?
He knew how to take advantage of the process, if not use the process, and he built his own big staff within there, and he achieved his means. He was more adept at it than the president was. But somebody who was quite close to Cheney, which was Steve Hadley, when he took over the process in the second term of the administration, actually brought the discipline back to it. He was also a protege of Scowcroft, though.
It has been suggested, David, that were Hillary Clinton to seek the presidency and win it, that you would be among those who would be at the very top of the shortlist to serve as her national security advisor. Have you heard these same rumblings?
Only from my mother and my wife. I mean, I don't think it's been suggested in any serious circles. I do think, though, that Hillary Clinton would be a break with the tradition, in the sense that as a former Secretary of State, she would bring to the job an enormous amount of foreign policy experience. In fact, we haven't had a Secretary of State become president since James Buchanan. It was very common in the beginning of the Republic. It stopped in the middle of the 19th century. But in a global environment, having that kind of experience and having somebody who's actually managed part of the process would be a big plus.
Our visitor to the Foxhole today has been David Rothkopf, publisher of Foreign Policy Magazine and foreignpolicy.com, and the author most recently of National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear, published in October by Public Affairs. That's going to do it for this episode of the Foxhole. I'm your host, James Rosen, signing off from the Washington Bureau of Fox News. You can follow me on Twitter, @JamesRosenFNC. We'll see you next time.